Spain emerged from civil war a very different nation from that promised by the Republican government in early 1930s. Exhausted, divided, and destroyed by years of civil conflict, the scars of the Spanish Civil War were long-lasting. The people were among the first to experience the horrors of modern warfare in Europe and the privations of civil war, and these effects were long-lasting. One can analyze the reasons for the nationalist victory by considering the weaknesses of the Republicans versus the strengths of the nationalists. Caballero became head of the coalition government in September 1936. His rule was weakened by the fact that the Republicans were politically divided. Indeed, Republicans subscribed to widely different ideologies. The key divisions were between communists and socialists, who believed that the revolution should now be postponed until the war was won, and the anarchists, who argued that the war could only be won through revolutionary policies. The anarchists, dominant in Catalonia, Aragon, and Andalusia, encouraged revolution from below in the areas they controlled, and some historians suggest that this added a crucial hurdle for the Republicans, as they had to try to regain their centralized control. The communists and socialists had more influence in Madrid and Valencia. The regions of Catalonia, the Basque region, and Asturias became virtually independent. The war generally increased the popularity of the communists. The Communist Party exploited the fact that it was the only Republican group with clear foreign support from the USSR. However, to retain control, the communists often used terror tactics, which led to some resistance, even in sympathetic territories. The lack of unity between the forces of the Republic is exemplified in the 4 days of street fighting in Barcelona in May 1937, known as the May Days. Communists and socialists on one side and the anarchists on the other. The fighting became known as, again, the May Days, and as a result of this turmoil, Caballero was replaced by the Marxist Juan Negrin, the communist choice as leader. Negrin attacked the anarchist leaders, who were then imprisoned or executed. His more authoritarian regime lasted until March 1939, when there was a military coup in Madrid. The Republic lacked strong military leadership, and there was no unified command, and the communists and anarchists would not work together. Indeed, the anarchist militias and the Basques refused to be led by a central command structure. The Basques would not permit their forces to defend areas outside their own territory. In addition, loyal army officers with potentially valuable experience were not trusted by the Republic. In the first vital weeks of the war, the Republic was dependent on ineffective militia units that formed haphazardly. This meant that they fought a series of local conflicts rather than one clear overall campaign. Different fronts operated separately, although to some extent the situation was due to the territory held by the Republicans. Many battlefields were not within the range of their air force, and they failed to sustain offensive campaigns in 1937 at the Battle of Brunete. Indeed, it was not until the end of 1936 that the Republicans started to replace militias with a coherent popular army. In areas under anarchist control, industries, public utilities, and transport were taken over by workers' committees. In the countryside, collective farms were set up. However, neither of these systems could supply the needs of the Republic to fight the war. Some historians have argued that this situation was due more to the impact of the war than to a badly run government, but most believe that the collectives impaired the Republic's war effort. Production in the key areas of Catalan fell by 2/3 between 1936 and 1939, and the Republic was increasingly affected by food and raw material shortages. Inflation was also a problem. At the same time, wages were barely increasing. The international body known as the Non-Intervention Committee, or NIC, established by Britain and France in 1936 for the purpose of preventing foreign influx of support to the warring parties in Spain, also had an impact on the Republic. It starved the Republic of all credit. The USSR was the only country willing to trade with it. Even this trade had to be paid for using the entire gold reserves of Spain. Paul Preston has argued that communist control ultimately improved the situation by centralizing control, but this happened too late to save the Republic. Foreign aid has been seen as a critical factor in determining the outcome of the Spanish Civil War. Some historians have suggested its role has been exaggerated. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that foreign assistance given to the Republic was far more limited than that afforded to the nationalists. The main ally of the Republic was the USSR, and it was the Soviets who initially saved the Republic and enabled it to fight a civil war in 1936 and 37. The Soviet aircraft and tanks were better early on than the German and Italian counterparts. However, no Soviet troops were sent to fight. They committed only 1,000 aircraft, 750 tanks, and some advisors. In addition, this aid had to be paid for by the Republic, which sent, as we have seen, all of its gold reserves to Moscow. The other key allies of the Republicans were the international brigades, which were organized by the Soviet Comintern. Some 35,000 foreign volunteers went to fight in Spain. Although their role seems to have been significant in the defense of Madrid, overall their impact was limited. In 1938, the Soviets withdrew their support and the international brigades went home, a final blow for the Republic. Although France sent aid initially, their support ended when it joined Britain in the policy of non-intervention. This policy was primarily driven by anti-communist sentiments, but it also meant that Hitler and Mussolini had no opposition from the Western democracies. This policy has been condemned by many historians. The major strength of the Nationalists was unity. In July 1936, however, the Nationalists were almost as divided as the Republicans. Their only common aim was to overthrow the government. Initially, General Mola seemed more important than Franco, but after the first few weeks, Franco emerged as the leader. In September 1936, the generals decided they needed a unified command. It was agreed that Franco would assume political and military control. First, he was doing well in the war, and he was also in position in command of the Army of Africa, and also important German aid came through him. To achieve political unity, Franco needed to control both the Carlist and the Falange youth group. In 1937, their numbers were impressive, 70,000 and 1 million respectively. In April, Franco merged the two parties into one, known as the FET, or Spanish Traditionalist Party, and now it was under his control. Franco was also assisted by support from the church, which opposed the left and its secular ideologies. From the pulpit, church leaders would denounce atheist communism and call for a crusade to protect Christian civilizations. Indeed, Franco used a mixture of propaganda and terror in areas under his command. Although some historians argue that the Soviet involvement in the war, which may have been Stalin's deliberate policy, led to its extension, others have suggested that Franco gained power and authority from his victories on the battlefield, and that it was he who extended the war to enhance his own powers. The nationalistic politics of Franco were not undermined by foreign support given by Germany and Italy. Militarily, the Nationalists initially had similar problems to the Republicans. Columns of Carlist and Falangist militias attempted to operate alongside regular army units. In contrast, however, these militias were effectively drawn into the regular army. The Army of Africa played a significant role. It contained the best troops in the country, and it could cover for other forces while they were being trained and equipped. In open and mobile offensive operations, the Army of Africa proved itself the most effective force in the entire Civil War. The unified command was key to nationalist success. Franco's leadership was accepted by other generals and right-wing parties. Ultimately, Italian forces were under his command too. They were successful in pushing on and winning offenses, and were also able to adopt effective defensive tactics during the Republican offensive campaign of 1937. The Nationalists had sound communication and managed to equip their growing army throughout the Civil War. They could also rely on their large number of junior officers. Franco was able militarily, and he was a great political leader. He would often not pursue more radical advice given to him by his German and Italian advisors. His concern for his troops ensured that the majority were obedient. The business community backed the Nationalists, which meant that they could get credit to buy war supplies. Also, by September 1936, they were in control of the main food-producing areas. After their successes in 1937 in the North, they added the main industrial areas to their control. The Nationalists also benefited from international trade and credit, which was not restricted. It has been estimated that the USA gave $700 million in credit during the course of the war. This meant that Franco's forces could buy all the rubber and oil they needed and acquired from U.S. companies. As suggested, some historians have argued that foreign aid was a crucial factor in the Nationalist victory over the Republic. Some have said that the conflict became an international crisis whose solution was decided by other countries. Indeed, the rebels benefited from more aid, which was better quality than that given to the Republicans, and its supply was continuous throughout the war. The Germans had airlifted Franco's army from Morocco to the mainland in the first stage of the war. The Germans also committed the Condor Legion to the war. The Portuguese sent troops and permitted supplies to be sent along its border with Spain. This assistance was significant in several ways. It allowed the Nationalists to fight in the first place owing to the German airlift. And then, as technology improved, German planes also gave them an advantage. Franco's command was not compromised, and after an Italian defeat, he was able to take command of the Italian troops under the Spanish army. The key benefit for the Nationalists, however, was not the manpower, as most of their armies were made of Spanish people. It was the modern equipment they received. The following are the effects of the Spanish Civil War. There was a social impact with a conservative backlash, especially for women. This was a very devout Catholic society, and they banned divorce, civil marriages, even mixed gender classrooms. Girls' education was going to shift to more of a domestic sphere, whereas men had a whole different other education. Everything in society was incredibly conservative. The Civil War had brought great human and material destruction to Spain. Over 100,000 Republicans were killed during the war and about 70,000 Nationalists. Moreover, the killing continued after the war as Franco launched a terror campaign to eradicate the opposition. It is estimated that a further 40,000 to 200,000 were killed during this period known as the White Terror, and the movie Pan's Labyrinth describes that. Thousands of Republicans and their sympathizers were held for years in concentration camps and prisons. Often, Republican children were taken from their parents to be re-educated. Some were placed with reliable nationalist Catholic families, while others were sent to orphanages where they were indoctrinated against the views and actions of their own parents. Divisions and hatred remained in Spanish society for decades. Spain's economy was devastated by the war. Some 10 to 15% of its wealth was destroyed, and per capita income was 28% lower in 1939 than in 1935. 70% of Madrid's factory machinery needed to be replaced, and its communication systems, including the city's tram network, had to be rebuilt. Around a third of its merchant shipping was out of action. There was high inflation due to the cost of fighting the war and the method used to attempt to pay for it, printing money. The Republican land reform was reversed by Franco, and Spain's agricultural economy remained inefficient and ineffective. Laborers had to tolerate periodic unemployment, and landowners were not interested in modernization. In addition, Spain had massive debts to pay. Due to the human cost of the war, there was a corresponding lack of skilled workers and an overriding general labor shortage. Spain attempted to find foreign loans for investment, but Britain demanded that debt was paid back first. The Germans also wanted the Spanish to repay the cost of aid sent to them before investment was made. The economy may have improved due to the outbreak of World War II. Franco seems to have attempted to gain leverage over Spain's debt to Britain and France in August 1939 by offering to remain neutral and not ally Spain with Nazi Germany. He also had discussions with the Germans, presumably offering a similar exchange in November and December. Once war broke out, Britain and France relented and signed trade agreements with Spain. But the German exploitation of Spain's resources during World War II may also have weakened the economy. The original debt remained after the war, and this gave Britain, France, and the U.S. influence in Franco's Spain. Spain was in isolation after World War II and suffered a famine in 1946. With industrial output at a level below that of 1918, Spain's economy may have been saved by aid from the right-wing Argentine dictator Perón. Nevertheless, in the longer term, as the Cold War took hold, Spain was less isolated, and with some reforms in the 1950s and 60s, it developed a powerful capitalist economy. Spain industrialized and also developed a strong service industry. Franco emerged from the war as Spain's dictator. He remained in power until his death in 1975, ruling, as Paul Preston writes, as if it were a country occupied by a victorious foreign army. Franco's regime declared they had to save the country from communism. The White Terror that ensued led to the killing of thousands of Republicans and the exodus of 500,000 Spaniards who fled to neighboring countries or Latin America. They included most of the intellectuals of Spain: teachers, lawyers, researchers, doctors, famous writers, poets, artists, and musicians. Those that remained had to conform to Franco's authoritarian, Catholic, and conservative views. In 1939, the law of political responsibility made supporters of the Republicans before or during the war liable to punishment, including confiscation of lands. This law allowed for the transfer of vast amounts of land from Republicans to the state. Also, the key objectives of the new regime was to restore the power of the privileged class and to control the working class. They used the church to do this. The church reforms during the Republic time were repealed, and indeed the 1950s has been termed the era of the national church. Government and church combined to preach order, hierarchy, and discipline. The church took up the cause of the workers and created links within their movements, but most historians argue that this was an attempt to infiltrate and prevent any more communist groups from rising up. Also, the aspirations of the Basque and Catalans for autonomy was also ended. The suppression and removal of all political opposition led to a period of political stability in Spain. Fear of state repression meant that Spain appeared more unified than it had been for decades. Nevertheless, the defeat of the fascist powers in World War II made Franco more vulnerable. Under pressure from monarchists, Franco agreed to restore the king, but kept himself as head of state. The army also lost its preeminence in society after Spain's last colony, Morocco, gained its independence in 1956. Without an empire to run and with no real external or internal threat, the old-style Spanish army became defunct. Franco increasingly delegated control from the 1960s, and following his death, a democracy was restored in 1977. But the results of the war and the nationalist victory for Spain had meant that it was a country frozen in time. No modernization took place for 36 years. The rest of Europe shunned Spain until Franco died.